recording. All right. Okay. Uh, so welcome everyone, wherever you may be in the world, to this presentation of the Modern Japan History Association's New Books on Japan series. My name is Nick Kapur. I'm an associate professor of Japanese history at Rutgers University-Camden. And if you're interested in learning more about the Modern Japan History Association or how to become a member, you can visit our website at mjha.org. And so let me begin by introducing our presenters for today. So we are very excited to have with us Susan Westhafer Furukawa, who is Associate Professor of Modern Languages and Literatures at Beloit College. Professor Furukawa received her PhD in East Asian languages from Indiana University, and her research focuses on the intersection of history and popular culture in Japan. In her teaching, she helps her students to understand how the narratives people create are subject to cultural, historical, and socio-political influences, and to examine the ways in which language and stories are often used to curate our understanding of the environment and our world. And today she will be presenting on her first book, The Afterlife of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Historical Fiction and Popular Culture in Japan. I have a copy here. I encourage you all to check it out, which was published by Harvard University Asia Center Press in 2022. And this book looks at how and why the biography of the 16th century samurai Toyotomi Hideyoshi continues to remain relevant and contested in the present day. In addition, Professor Furukawa is currently working on a new research project which looks at the ways in which women writers of historical fiction have used the genre to dismantle patriarchal narratives of Japan's past. And then we are absolutely thrilled to have with us as our interlocutor today, Professor Rebecca Copeland, who is Professor of Japanese Language and Literature at Washington University in St. Louis. Having received her PhD in Japanese literature from Columbia University, Professor Copeland's research and teaching focus on modern Japanese women writers, examining the way their gender has defined and often confined their literary production. In addition to many, many articles, book chapters, and edited volumes, which are far too numerous to mention today, Professor Copeland's major publications include two book-length monographs. First, The Sound of Wind, The Life and Works of Unochiyo, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 1992, and Lost Leaves, Women Writers of Meiji Japan, also from the University of Hawaii Press in 2000. And most recently, Professor Copeland edited the Handbook of Modern and Contemporary Japanese Women Writers, which was a collection of 24 essays by scholars from around the world. And in addition to her extremely impressive academic publications, Professor Copeland is also an accomplished translator of Japanese literature, as well as a creative writer of novels and short stories. So if you're interested in finding out more about her many projects and the latest things she's working on, you can visit her website at www.rebecca-copeland.com. Anyway, without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Furukawa and Professor Copeland. So please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Nick. And we agreed that I will get us started. And I want to first of all thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, Nick, for the invitation to join the Modern Japanese History Association book talk. It's really a delight and a privilege to be able to sit here with all of you, but also with Susan Furukawa to discuss her recent monograph, The Afterlife of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And Nick held it up, but I'll just show it too. It's just such a beautiful book. And not only is the cover amazing, but it comes with gorgeous color illustrations throughout the book. So it's really a rich volume. So I'm going to remark briefly on the book and then turn it over to Susan for a more thorough overview of some of the questions that drove her research, and also a brief introduction to the chapters. And following that, she and I will converse on some of the issues, and finally there'll be time for questions from the audience. So let me begin by saying that this is a very compelling study of the way a historical personage, in this case Toyotomi Hideyoshi, is treated over time to different portrayals. Susan investigates the way each retelling of the Hideyoshi story is adapted and retrofitted to meet the interests of the individual author's contemporary time. In the process, Hideyoshi, whoever he may have been as a historical personage, stretches and transforms like a chimera to appeal to new audiences and concerns, rising up from the page as a new life, enjoying new afterlives. One aspect of this study that I particularly enjoyed, and which I hope to circle back to in the discussion, is the way Susan's analysis moves beyond the tracing of an individual literary historical figure and opens into an exploration of the entanglement of history and fiction, questioning the veracity and primacy of both. As Susan tells us in her work, paraphrasing Hayden White, quote, all history is narrative. And if that's the case, then is it by extension true that all narrative is history? In the works that she analyzes, we find that the authors claim, quote, that they are simply extending the boundaries of the narratives that already exist, adding and taking away details to meet the needs of their stories. End of the quote. Susan sets up her successive discussions by citing Narita Ryuichi's notion of the three axes of time in historical fiction. And these are the time in which the story is set, the time in which the story is written, and the time during which it is being read. And all of these impinge on the way a story integrates into its own historical context and helps us understand the motivation for writing the work in the first place and the parameters under which the story might be read. As she presents the different Hideyoshi retellings, Susan comes back to these three axes in order to frame her discussions. In the book, we move chronologically in these Hideyoshi afterlives by starting, naturally, I guess, with the first life, the life of the historical Hideyoshi, who we soon find is already fashioning his own story. So it's interesting that Hideyoshi existed as an afterlife even while he was still alive. From this very succinct beginning, we're introduced to the different portrayals and afterlives. We move from Oze Hoan's Taikoki of 1626 to Yoshikawa Eiji's Shinsho Taikoki of the 1930s and 40s, to the post-war works by Shiba Ryotaro and others. We are introduced to parodic retellings and to also the effacing of Hideyoshi in works by modern women writers. And I have to say, that's probably my favorite chapter. And finally, in what I feel is her most surprising and inventive chapter, we turn to the way Hideyoshi has been redescribed and reinscribed in museums and other tourist destinations. Through each chapter, we see the way the character of Hideyoshi is augmented or attenuated to meet the needs of his relative authors. His egoism and greed miraculously melts away in many of his afterlives, and he becomes a generous champion of the people, a romantic partner, a frugal statesman. I mean, forget about the golden tea room, a frugal statesman, and a savvy businessman. And so these are the many iterations we have of Hideyoshi. And I'd like now to let Susan talk a little bit about the work herself.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that great introduction. And thank you, Nick, for inviting me to talk. And thanks to all of you for letting a couple of non-historians talk about a book that addresses history. So let me get my slideshow going. You should be able to see it. All right, so everybody can see it. Thumbs up. Yep, good. Yeah, so the Afterlife of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, I'm really interested in the historical fiction based on Ose Juan's 17th century biography of him called Taikoki. And as Nick mentioned, I explore how and why Hideyoshi has had a continued and ever-changing presence in the 20th and 21st centuries. In this short presentation, I want to talk about how I got interested in this research, what questions drove it, what surprised me along the way, and then I'll offer some highlights from chapters. And I very much look forward to questions afterwards. So let's see if I can get this to do it. So ironically, what got me interested in this topic is the 1996 Taiga drama Hideyoshi. And I say it's ironic because at the time, 1996, I didn't know who Hideyoshi was, and my Japanese was terrible. So I also didn't understand what was happening in the show. But what I did understand is that a lot of people were watching it, a lot of people were talking about it, and they were having this shared experience of consuming the past. And that fascinated me. And so that's kind of where I got interested in the topic. And as I was in graduate school, I wanted to find some tale that kept being retold, and I didn't want it to be Chushingura, right? Because that's the one that everyone knows. And so just by happenstance, I encountered Taikoki. And, you know, you can do a National Diet Library search of the term Taikoki, and depending on how you look for it, you'll get thousands of hits. So when I tell you that I managed to pick a pretty good topic to look at, I'm not kidding. I mean, it's just the gift that keeps on giving. But first, Hideyoshi. I think most of you know who Hideyoshi is, but he was a 16th century warlord and is known as one of the three unifiers. And then Taikoki, as I said, was the biography of Hideyoshi written by Ose Juan, and it was published somewhere around 1626. And if you think about the dates there, right? So the Toyotomi clan fell maybe not, not even 20 years before. So there's a very kind of close relationship to this text and the end of the Toyotomi line. As I said, he's one of the three uniformers, the three unifiers, along with Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu. I often get asked the question, why Hideyoshi? And I promise to answer that in the Q&A if somebody asks it, but I want to kind of get through everything before then. So what surprised me the most really is how often I encounter Hideyoshi once I started looking for him. I mean, Hello Kitty, manga, these great yurikara who've appeared in Kyoto at the Kodaiji. But I think one of my favorites is this one. This is 2010 at Sunshine City in the Toyota showroom. I walk around the corner and there's his armor. And he showed up on multiple lists, but the one that I love the best is who would make the best boss, essentially. He loses to Tokugawa Ieyasu and Date Masamune, but he's holding strong there in third. And so just this concept of Hideyoshi, as Rebecca said, as being kind of this great boss is an interesting one and one of many tales that we hear. Quick search this week showed me that have no fear, there's a Reiwa Taikoki. So Taikoki's made its way into the new imperial era, and I have no doubt that he will continue, the Taikoki and Hideyoshi will continue to flourish. So the questions that drove my research, again, as a literary scholar looking at historical fiction, why is historical fiction such a widely read genre in Japan? What kinds of stories from the past are most attractive to readers? How does this mass revisiting of the past impact how people think about history and their sense of national and personal identity? And how does the cycle of production and consumption influence the way that well-known stories are told? The way I look at all of these tales of Hideyoshi, I call them Hideyoshi Den, right? Because there's this massive body of work that just needs to be looked at together in some ways. I think this book makes some important interventions. It provides a useful framework by which to study iterations or versions of historical narrative. It offers an in-depth look at common discourses about historical fiction in Japan, and it provides a multimedia and multi-generational analysis of representations of Hideyoshi. So in the first chapter, I provide an overview of Hideyoshi's life and as well as a brief literary history of Ose Juan's Taikoki. And again, keep forgetting to pick one, but again, Taikoki, this original Taikoki is really important because if you look at what comes after, many, many people are citing it. And the reason that I find that really interesting is because even in Ose's Taikoki, there's a story being told. These are the first two chapters of Ose's Taikoki, or not chapters, first two paragraphs of Taikoki. And I want to draw your attention to the one in orange. The reason people suffer is because they veer from the righteous path. and give themselves over to their desires. When one yields to avarice, his descendants are ultimately brought to destruction. This is why all must learn to follow the righteous path. So Oze was a Confucian scholar, but also clearly he has a very specific interpretation of what happened to Hideyoshi. You know, Hideyoshi made some bad choices. He wasn't a righteous leader, and as a result, the end of his family line. So, you know, as Rebecca mentioned, Hideyoshi was already telling stories about himself, but then this original text that a lot of future stories reference is also telling a specific story. So look at that in the first main chapter, and I kind of addressed some of the pre-modern versions of taikoki, but I quickly realized when I was doing this project that I had to narrow things down because I couldn't possibly cover all the taikoki that are out there. So the next chapter that I have is looking at a serialization of Shinsho Taikoki, which is by Yoshikawa Eiji, from 1939 to 1945, so smack dab in Japan's war experience in the mid-century. And you can see here that that Yoshikawa has a very specific view of history during the war. He says, "I believe that figures from our history, the heroes of old, never really die. When a cry goes out calling them in response to circumstances in the contemporary society, they return from the land of the dead and they offer their services to Japan." So this quote gives you a very good idea of how Yoshikawa Eiji was thinking about Hideyoshi. In the chapter I talk, it's a really kind of fascinating process by which Yoshikawa Eiji came to write this serialization for Yomiuri Shimbun. But what I look at is the ways in which he creates a very specific taikoki, the ways in which Hideyoshi is mobilized during the war. So in his hands, Hideyoshi is made into a model soldier and leader who's ready and willing to sacrifice greatly for the nation. And not unimportantly, he ends his story of Hideyoshi right when Hideyoshi reaches the apex of power. And he never goes back to end that tale, right? It's a strong indication of the type of story he wants to tell. Another thing I want to point out here is even during the paper shortages during World War II, when there was only one broadsheet, so 4 total pages, taikoki took up a very large portion. It was serialized almost nonstop. There were a few days when it didn't show up for 6 years, and always taking up the same amount of paper space. But by contrast, the ending of the serialization, which coincided with Japan's war loss, is that very small box on the back page that says, "Due to the wishes of the author, the publication of taikoki in this paper will cease immediately." So in the chapter, I go into great detail about, how Yoshikawa is creating this is creating this Hideyoshi, and how many people are buying into this image of Hideyoshi. Perhaps the one that I find the most fascinating is that somehow during World War II, he becomes an altruistic Pan-Asianist, and who we should all learn from because he had such great success on the Asian continent when he invaded Korea. So again, not the story that we usually hear. And then after the war, so in the next chapter, I look at post-war, the early post-war, Hideyoshi becomes a businessman. And so this is a series that was coming out in the 50s, really right after the occupation, called Salaryman Shusei Taikoki, or the Taikoki of a salaryman making his way in the world. And in this chapter, I look at different versions of Hideyoshi that are published during World War II in this way in which his violent militaristic past is somehow distance, or this legacies of war somehow becomes distant as he becomes a businessman. So in this particular series, on the right in the picture, which is a film still, that's Hidekichi, same kanji, different pronunciation. And Hidekichi has recently graduated from college, and he's making his way to Kacho, from the start to Kacho, of Japan's greatest car company. So not only do we see these kind of business novels that have Hideyoshi as a character, we also see business manuals. So you too can be a human resource manager like Hideyoshi. This is an example of the kinds of the things that were coming out, but there are also magazine articles, and in many different ways, right? Hideyoshi is associated with the shusei, right? This making your way in the world. This is what people are interested in and the story they're interested in telling. As the 60s go on, as we start to get toward the 70s, we start to see parody. And this is my most favorite probably, and I hope to translate this someday, but this is, oh, sorry. This is an illustration from Tsuyasaka's novella Yamazaki. And in this novella, she is really questioning and in a lot of it is making fun of this tendency to take a 16th century samurai and make him a 20th century hero. And the way he does that is he puts everything that Hideyoshi and his vassals are doing into the modern context, and specifically into pristine bullet train cars. And so seppuku, right, ritual suicide, does not look quite as heroic when it's being done in the aisle of a bullet train car. And perhaps my favorite scene from this is when the chef, the bullet train chef, commits ritual suicide because his meal is delayed, and quote, all of the waitresses follow him in death by stabbing themselves in the throat with their forks. So again, this kind of parody of this tendency to want to make Hideyoshi a hero starts kind of in earnest with, I think, with Tsuyasaka. And Tsuyasaka's novella was a nice transition for me into the chapter that Rebecca mentioned, where I look at Nagai Michiko's Oja no Suma, Hideyoshi no Tsuma Onene, or The Monarch's Wife, and Ariyoshi Sawako's Izumo no Okune, which we often translate as the Kabuki dancer. And both of these works, and again, there are so many things I could have chosen, but I chose these two works in particular because both of them were highlighting this tension about how history was being told. And they were also focusing on women who did not fit the good wife, wise mother model at all. Both Okuni and Onene did not have children. They both, in Okuni's case, she was outside the family structure altogether. And so I could talk more about that, but that's really what interested me in these two novels in particular. So even though the novels aren't explicitly feminist, they contest the limited notions of womanhood and history written by men. So their protagonists labor under patriarchal constraints, but they still challenge the economies of power that put those women there. So again, I'd love to talk more about all this, and then the last chapter, I drew this kind of interesting transition into talking about tourist sites. And really the reason I did that is because, you know, Hideyoshi continues to be alive and well in popular culture, and the tensions between the history that's there and kind of Japan's goals to invite Asian tourists was an interesting one to me. So that was part of the reason I was interested. But then also I visited these sites and I saw things that made me just want to write about them. One of the sites I looked at is the Saga Prefectural Nagoya Castle Museum, which is the site where Hideyoshi launched his invasions of Korea. And the second one is Kodaiji Temple in Kyoto. Both places are examples of the kind of selective retelling of tales we see about Hideyoshi. This museum in particular I find really fascinating because the invasions of Korea are contextualized in the quote unquote long history of friendship between Japan and Korea. So if you are going through the museum, this tale of invasion, or this kind of exhibition of invasion is really subsumed by a larger tale, a larger narrative that they're hoping to tell. And even when you get to the section that's looking at those years, you see a lot more focus on the cultural gifts, so to speak, that Hideyoshi gave to Japan at that time, right? The kinds of art and other things that he was focused on. And so there's a kind of a pushing down of the militaristic narrative and a bringing up of a cultural narrative. And the very first time I visited this site, when I was thinking about Hideyoshi in particular, I talked to the head archaeologist, and he said this to me. He said, at least once a week, a Japanese visitor tells me to stop doing this excavation because some history is, quote, best left hidden. And that really fascinated me. And I continue to watch the progress of the excavating of the site, and then eventually the move or the decision to not try to rebuild any of the site, but instead to offer this virtual reality tour of it. And so this kind of this moving between visible and invisible, stated and unstated, was really fascinating to me. And so that's why I wanted to write about it. And then Kodaiji, if you haven't been to Kodaiji, you should go. But Kodaiji you know, again, is a really famous Hideyoshi site. This is where his wife Onene went after he died, and this is where she spent her remaining years. The first time I went to this temple, the narrative that the docents told me was of Onene's independence, of how she had more financial means than any woman of her time, and the ways that she was able to influence important men around her. So that was the original story that I would hear from the, or again, narrative that I would hear. And then, you know, 15 years ago I went, and suddenly Hideyoshi was there, and I just could not understand what he would be doing there. And he was not only there, but he was there in this kind of chibi manga form. And it's a little bit small, but basically the narrative now is that if you want to have a happy marriage, like Hideyoshi and Onene, you should come pray at this temple. You know, and so every year I go, and there's just something new to see. You know, and they even promised that one time they're going to get, at some point when I go, they're going to get the Yurikara out for me so I can actually see them in person, because I've only seen pictures. But you can see there's a move, very much a move toward this narrative of romance, and you know, now you can have a wedding at the temple, and it's pretty fascinating. But the narrative that the docents tell also changed, and I'll admit I was really surprised by this, because I was kind of pushing, you know, what's going on with this narrative, and I didn't expect this. So this is what the docent said to me: young people today could learn a lot from the example set by Onene and Hideyoshi. Men should seek to rise up in the world, Shusei Suru, like Hideyoshi, and women should assert their power in the background, supporting their husband and his men like Onene did. The modern love story should look a lot more like the relationship between Hideyoshi and Onene, and less like what people see on TV. So, to be clear, Hideyoshi had a lot of women in his life. I'm not sure that Onene would tell her story in the same way. I could be wrong, but anyway, so that this is really an important, or like not important, but a really interesting pivot that the temple is doing that just really fascinated me. So that's, you know, that's why I made this move to talk about, you know, to talk about the temple and the museum. So, and then in the epilogue, which I title Whither Hideyoshi, I offer a brief overview of all sorts of other things that are out there about Hideyoshi: manga, films, TV shows. And really my purpose there is just to give readers a sense of just how much of the Hideyoshi Den there is, and how ripe his story is, or this particular body of work is, for more research. So finally, I just want to talk briefly about my new project. So the new project I've tentatively titled Warrior Princesses, Willful Wives, and Long-Suffering Mothers, Japanese Women Write History. It's a cross-generational comparative study of historical fiction written by women. I have some examples of some of the novels and some of the authors I'll be looking at. In it, I'll analyze how women authors from the late 16th century to the present have used their writing to reveal untold stories of women from Japan's samurai past, and or to offer a critical eye to so-called Sengoku heroes. Though I'm still fairly early in this project, some things I've already noticed with the novels I've read include that when women write history or historical fiction, they tend to subvert notions about how and what a woman can and should write. They amplify the voices that have often been silenced, providing a much richer view of Japan's past. And they write about the domestic sphere in ways that often allow for greater criticism of the male heroes around them. And finally, they overtly or covertly question patriarchal historical narratives. So I'm still working on that. I'm excited about it, and I'd love to talk about this project as well. Yeah, so that's it. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and also, you know, I just want to list some of the funding I got as I was working on this project. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Susan, for this presentation. I think you really helped showcase the way that the chapters cohere and grow, build on one another. And you also make clear how immense a topic, how enormous a topic this is, Hideyoshi is. The amount of material and the complexities of the material that you had to negotiate must have been overwhelming at times. But your study doesn't reveal any of that. It pulls things together in a very coherent way that that shows the different versions and the different perspectives of Hideyoshi. And these versions compete with one another, but they also complement one another as well. So, but I'm going to back up and go back to the question you kind of put out there in the beginning, tantalizingly so, about why you chose to work on Hideyoshi. I mean, you did kind of imply some of your reasons, but there are so many historical figures. Was there anything particular about Hideyoshi that led you to this project?
I get that question all the time, so I'm glad you asked it. Honestly, why Hideyoshi? Because of Taikoki. So for me, if you're asking me personally, why did I devote a large portion of my life to writing about Hideyoshi, is because I was really fascinated with this text that kept changing. But I also have a question. I mean, I haven't answered that kind of larger question. Why is Hideyoshi someone worth looking at in terms of this question, right? I think one of them is what you mentioned, what Stephen Greenblatt would call self-fashioning. Hideyoshi was so intent on telling his own stories that he really, in a way, he kind of pulls the seams apart of any true story of Hideyoshi that we can put our finger on. I mean, that's me as a literature scholar saying that. And again, historians are probably cringing a bit as I say that, but I mean, he really kind of offers this kind of deconstructed picture of himself, or an overly constructed picture of himself, depending on how you want to put it. So that's one reason. He, of course, was important in Japanese history, and I can go into lots of reasons why, but obviously he was a very interesting, important hero figure, let's say, in Japanese history. I think the fact that he is so often heroicized, if you tell somebody that you're doing taikoki, they will start telling you stories about their favorite story. You know, oh, he warmed Oda Nobunaga's sandals in his kimono, or oh, he built the castle in a day. So there are all these stories that people know. And so this kind of, the fact that people know these stories and that he's always not top of mind, but he's often talked about, made the project interesting to me. Let me see, what am I missing? Oh, and this rags to riches story, right? This idea of shisei or gekkokujo, right? The lower person over, like, supplanting their leader. These parts of his tale are particularly important to a lot of people when they talk about Hideyoshi, and so he's in some ways, he's not, in some ways he's a more extreme version of that, right? He starts as somebody with no name and manages to become, the leader of the realm. And so he lends himself to stories in that way as well. So I think he was just a rich character to pull from. And I also think, the way the last 10 years of his life really don't work very well with the first 50 or so years of his life also makes him an interesting character, because if you're going to tell the whole story of Hideyoshi, it's a complicated story. I think a lot of people want to tell this more simplified. He was a hero. He rose up. He was charismatic. He you were just talking to me about, or I guess Nick was just talking to me about an NHK show you saw on the plane, right? And so that kind of propagandistic look at Hideyoshi still exists. And so it's a little bit of a long answer, but there are just lots of things to pull from, I think, when you're talking about Hideyoshi.
That makes a lot of sense, and helps me accept some of the adulation of Hideyoshi when I'm more familiar with the last part of his life. So would you go over that a little bit? What are the
Sure.
conflicts between the two halves of his life, the two parts?
Sure. So, Yoshikawa Eiji, when he was asked, why didn't you write about the last 10 years? He said, I'm more interested in the story of his rise to power. Once he rose to power, right, and he, unified what we call Japan in 1590, right? So he was Tenka, he was the lord of the realm. He decided that he needed a bigger realm, right? So he launched invasions of Korea, both of which were failed, but also which we could say are the first Japanese aggressions in East Asia. He killed his heir, who was also his nephew, in a very public way. He ordered the death of his of his consultant and tea master, Sen Norikyu. And so he did a lot. He's been described in some novels, especially novels written by women, as having mental illness, as having lost his mind. So there's a lot of unpredictability and things that we would not describe as being diplomatic, or some of the other ways that Hideyoshi has been described from the first part of his life.
Yeah, I think I'm probably more familiar with Teshigahara Hiroshi's film Rikyu that you mentioned in the book, and that's sort of, I mean, he's presented almost as a buffoon in places, and so I'm wondering, when you were doing some of this, this is not a very proper question, but did you get frustrated with him, or did you get frustrated with the biographers who were erasing the flaws and turning him into this paragon?
Yeah, maybe I should have, but those were the things I was interested in, and things that really kind of made me excited. Like, why are they doing this versus these other stories, and what are their sources, and things like that. So no, those were my favorite part. But yeah.
Good. Yes, we'll have time for questions in a little bit. Well, Susan and I are going to hog the screen for a bit more. So I want to talk to you about your title and the use of the term afterlife. That always puts me in mind of German philosopher Walter Benjamin in his I think 1923 essay, The Task of the Translator. And in this piece, The Task of the Translator, he talks about the way a translation participates in the afterlife of a text. The translation, of course, is different from the original, but it pulls the original into a new world and gives it new life or continuing life. A translation also allows the original work to exist in a new world and to grow beyond its own linguistic and historical contexts. So to that extent, I see the many versions of Hideyoshi doing the same thing. The retellings are, of course, not the same as the authentic, real-to-life Hideyoshi, if there ever really was such a thing. But each retelling sheds new light on who Hideyoshi was or was perceived to be. And we get new angles and new approaches to Hideyoshi through each new version. So can you comment on the way the various retellings serve to provide a deeper appreciation of the historical Hideyoshi, even as they may take liberties with the historical view or the historical record?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would agree that a similar thing is happening with Hideyoshi. Even though the translations are not linguistic, they're very much they're chronicles, maybe not the right word, but it brings to mind again the Narita street axes, right? When is the story set? When is it written? And when is it read? Right? That when is it written piece is really important. And I think you see these translations or interpretations of Hideyoshi happening because of when these stories are written. I mean, I would say that his meaning of historical figure has never been stagnant. And that's, again, me as a non-historian saying that. And I think that I've got some Hayden White and Narita influence there as well. But I don't know that historical figures are ever stagnant. They're always being interpreted. The past is always being used in the present in different ways. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for the question, really, other than to say, yes, I agree. That's similar to what's happening with Hideyoshi.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to talk more about the genre of historical fiction. You mentioned that there's a great appeal of history in Japan, and in Margaret Mell's very positive review of your book. She talks about sort of the genre of appropriation, and she puts your study in this work of studies of appropriation alongside Gorgana Ivanova and others who deal with not just historical fiction, but taking from the past, and how so that happens so often in Japanese literature and arts. Could you comment a little bit on why you think that may be the case?
Yeah, when I think about historical fiction or history in particular, so warrior history in particular, I think that that people love to identify with this kind of warrior culture. I mean, the Japanese men's soccer team is samurai blue. People love this idea of the samurai salaryman. So I think part of it is just pulling back this heroic, kind of strong and brave notion of the male. And I think especially that's been interesting to look at in terms of if there have been situations in which Japan feels somewhat emasculated, you'll often see then that Japan is, there are periods where there's some emasculation that might be happening, right? That where Japan is, not the #1 economy in the world anymore, or, things like that. And so I feel like in cases like that, maybe this is one time. What I've noticed is that tales about Sengoku warriors in particular tend to be more popular at certain periods of time, right? They're more widely consumed when people are needing to hear certain kinds of stories. That said, I actually went through the whole database of taiga drama from 1965 to whenever it was that I finished writing the book. And Hideyoshi appears in like 40% of the taiga drama, and any taiga drama that has Hideyoshi or Sengoku warlord as its main character tends to be the most watched NHK program in any given year. So why is that? I just think that is a very exciting period in history. This idea of somebody rising up and overcoming hardship is something that people like to buy into. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. I'm kind of going on a little bit of a drive right there, but
no, this I think that's I like that you brought in the sort of the gendered aspect of historical fiction, and so that brings me to a question about the attitudes towards women writers in historical fiction, and I'd like to refer to your chapter in the Handbook of Modern and Contemporary Women Writers. You wrote the chapter on women in historical fiction. And you note that women writers were traditionally excluded from the genre Rekishi Shousetsu. You cite the critic and author Oka Shohei, who argues that women aren't suited to the genre because they are really only good at writing about feelings, writing about emotions, right? And so to quote from Oka, historical novels written by women naturally focus more on the domestic sphere and thus fail to satisfy readers' interests in reading about history. So end of quote. In reply to Oka, you argue that the historical fiction that women do write, quote, pushes back against the limitations placed upon them, thereby creating deeply textured and fascinating novels that ask readers to re-examine their understanding of who and what constitutes history. So I'm end of quote from you. So can you comment further on women in historical fiction in Japan and how you see Nagai Michiko and Ariyoshi Sawako pushing back against the limitations placed on them?
Sure. I mean, I think I answered that question partly when I was talking. So maybe I want to move beyond Ariyoshi Sawako and Nagai Michiko.
Maybe
Although
talk about
Ariyoshi,
your upcoming or your project in the works.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm just thinking Ariyoshi Sawako is actually who Oka Shohei references and says, nobody wants to read about women in the household. Nobody cares. But if you read Ariyoshi Sawako, she gives these women some pretty critical voice, right? Okuni, the character that is, I guess I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Yeah, Okuni, the character that's the protagonist in Izumo no Okuni, is a completely marginalized character, right? She's the woman who we say founded Kabuki, right? And in the novel, so she's not in any of the social classes. She is essentially a beggar who's dancing to make money. In the novel, however, she keeps being in close proximity to Hideyoshi and to other men in his realm. So she's constantly observing what's happening and asking questions like, why would they burn down that castle? That's a way, they just built that castle. Why are they burning it down? And she's just asking, or, why did he pass that law? It's not going to help anybody. And maybe my favorite scene is when Okini sees Hideyoshi in person for the first time. And I don't remember the exact quote, but basically she describes him as being smaller than his sword. And she's just can't believe that, this man is first of all ruler of the realm. And second of all, supposedly has all this power, right? And throughout the novel, she's asking, what is a ruler of the realm anyway? And that's really not because she doesn't understand the term, but it's because she hasn't met any men in her life that she can see fulfilling that role. And I think that Hideyoshi makes this really interesting parallel because throughout the novel, Okuni is referred to as Tenkaichi, the best in Japan, the best dancer in Japan. But that term Tenka is also what's used for the leader of the realm. So there's this paralleling of this riverside beggar who has no children and who has money to the men who are in power. And so through this kind of paralleling of Okuni with these men, Hideyoshi Sawako is completely offering a different view of history, not completely, but she's clearly offering a different view of history, and she's doing it from the voice and from the perspective of a woman. And so, Oka Shohei, I don't think was reading Hideyoshi Sawako the same way I read her, to be fair, but I think it's really fascinating. And then another example, so one of the books that I'm looking at for my next project is, I'm going to put the name of it right now. The Lineage of Shadows is what it's called in English. And I'm having a brain fart right now on the author. Sugimoto Sonoko. Thank you, Sugimoto Sonoko. And it starts, the very first scene is Tomo, who is Hideyoshi's sister by the same father. And she's getting ready to meet his brother, Hidenaga. Is that his name? I'm suddenly panicking with names, but starting to meet who has a different father. And the scene is that Tomo's youngest son has just killed the maid. He's just killed the maid. And right within the first page, Tomo says, I'm afraid that he has also inherited the bad blood of the Toyotomi line. Right. So from the whole story is told from Tomo's perspective as a mother. And she's just constantly looking at what people are doing and saying, oh no, there it is again. It's clearly there's this line of insanity that's running through the Toyotomi line, and I cannot stop it. Right. So in the end, it doesn't stop until everyone has died, till all the men have died, right? All the men with that blood have died, including her sons. And she says, finally, I can be relieved that this won't go on. Right. So again, Oka Shohei, I don't know, that seems like a pretty clear criticism and an interesting analysis of history that to me I find really compelling.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And Nick, I think probably we have so many people wanting to ask questions. We should probably shift to the question of the audience period.
All right, let me turn off the recording.